We can't get very far in app development without doing view models and binding. So view models are a way in the app to be able to bind things on the UI, such as the names or the visuals, to data in the background that gets updated. Without this, we fall back to old conventions where we're updating the UI manually. Instead, what we should be doing is changing data in our data backend, and the view should automatically update to reflect data. In Avalonia, I'm going to use something called the Community MVVM Toolkit. You can use many others, but this is the one I prefer. Let's take a look at how we do this. One of the first things we need to do is actually install the toolkit for doing view models. We can write our own library, but there's just simply no point. We might as well just install one of the services. If we go to terminal down here, we can now type in .NET add package, and the one I'm going to use is the community toolkit.mvvm. That will install all the dependencies we need, and now we can simply start using it. We'll start by making a folder in the top level, and we'll call this view models. And inside of here, we're going to make our base view model to begin with. This will be the class we use for all view models. Inside of here, we want to inherit from observable object. And the observable object, as you can see, comes from the community toolkit. And all this object really does is handle the automatic firing of the events required when values change. We don't need to do anything else for now. Our base view model simply will be inheriting from this observable. So it gives us the ability to then add things we might want in every view model in the future. But for now, that class is all that we're going to use. And next up, what we'll do is add a class for this main window view. So in conventions, you could normally call the view model something like main window view model, or you could rename main window to main view, not normally window. So what we're going to call it is we're going to do main view model. We'll add that to the class, and this will inherit from the view model base. And let's also just take the time to rename this main window to main view, and this is going to help us keep some conventions as we start moving forward, where we want the main view model to match the name of the main view, but with the word model at the end. This will help us automatically start doing view model locators or view locators, where we bind to a view model and automatically find the view. Let's start with something simple in here, and let's just put, say, a private string underscore test, and we'll just give it a value of test. Now, this is just a normal private string. What we need is a public property that calls iNotifyPropertyChanged. And to do that, using the community toolkit, we can just tag this with observable property. And what this does in the background is add those classes for us. You can see here it's going to now complain because this code from the toolkit wants to alter our class and add public properties for this variable. So we have the word partial here. That allows this observable property to now alter this class. If we want to see what it's doing in the background, we can go to dependencies, .NET 8, source generators, community toolkit, and we can see here the main view model. This is the class that gets output and used inside our code. You can see it's now added a public string called test, not the private one. Inside it gets our test variable we made, and when it gets set, this is the important thing, it calls on property changing, changes the value, and then calls on property changed with the name of test. This is all that view models really are. It's a firing of this specific event, so the UI can hook into this event and know when this property changes to then update the UI. You can see it's added all of the events for us automatically. So this allows us to, instead of having to write all these bits of code, which you normally would have to, we can just tag a private member variable with observable property, and now this class will have a public property called test, like this, that we can now bind to. So for that, we'll go into the main view, and what you'd normally do in here is, in order to access, say we want to replace this home with the data from the view model, you'd normally have to do window.dataContext, and then you'd want to set this up to the view model, so in this case the main view model, and we'd need a new version of that. And to access that, we just need the XML namespace, we'll call it VM for view model, and this will be batch process 3.viewModels. So now we can get viewModel : main viewModel. This has now set up the window data context to main viewModel. And inside of here, let's say we want to change this text from home to something inside of this main viewModel, in which case it wants to be the word test. We can just open up the curly brackets, which is how we do binding. And in this case, we just type binding, and we should see the property test. You can see here it's going to moan, I presume, about not knowing the data type. And that will be because we need to also specify in here the x : data type, and then we want to do viewModel, main viewModel. So this tells this actual UI here what to expect when we're doing binding. And now you can see it's put in brackets the main viewModel, so it knows that's the type, .path = test. If we build, we should see test appear instead of the word home. And there we go, that's test. So now if we change the viewModel to test2 and come back, we might have to compile to get this to update. But you can see there now we have data binding. We clean this up normally, so instead of having just the data context set inside of the actual window and having this newed up in here, we can delete that and do exactly the same, but in the app, I believe it is, in here. So when the main window gets created, we are setting the main window to main view. So in here, so we do it in the coding backend instead, we can just set the data context here. And then for now, we'll just do a new main viewModel. And this we can obfuscate out later to have a dependency injection if we want to inject this viewModel from a dependency service. But for now, we've shifted that into the backend code ready for that. And in the front end, we no longer need to set the data context here. And if we rebuild, it should still update. You can see there, it's now updated there. And in this area, we've actually lost the data binding. And that's because the UI in this preview doesn't actually run this app code. So this doesn't get run in this view. We can fix that by using the special design.data context. And this will set now a data context just for the designer view. So this allows us to at least design visually in here with a newed up instance of this. It won't always follow your exact app. So if we change the logic here to be different, this example preview here might be different. But in most cases, this is fine. And obviously you've got the ability to change this view model to a design specific view model that only shows up in this preview that differs when you run the app as well. So what we have at the minute is we have the main view bound correctly now to a main view model that gets newed up in the app XAML file here. And we've data bound it just to the menu of test. So you can see here, you could bind this to a localization string, for example, instead of just a public property with a single text value. But this was just to prove we have data binding working. Let's remove that and change it back to home for now. So I think what we'll do is let's make this side menu collapsible. So it can be like a hidden feature. Let's say double click this icon and this will collapse down to the side with just icons. If we try to visualize what that wants to be, we would have to say, let's collapse this down. We'd want to probably delete all the text like this. So the text isn't there. Let's just do that for all and we can undo. We'd probably want to replace this for, say, an icon. So just like that. Change the width down. And there we've got something similar to a collapsed menu. So I quite like the look of that. It looks pretty well spaced and everything else. So we now know what we need to do. We need to change the source image to a specific image. We need to bind this width potentially to an expected width. And we need to either delete all these names or hide the labels for the second text. So let's do that now with view models. Let's just undo this. And let's just go through what we said there. In the view model now, we will need one that is, say, a boolean of underscore and side menu, or keeping with convention, side menu expanded. We'll set that to true by default. And now we can tag that with if we go to here, we'll do visible. You can see is visible, and it would be binding side menu expanded. If we get all of those and paste it to each menu item, we should be able now just change this to false, build, and we should see these all hide like we do. This will be, you can either bind this now with a value converter, so when the property of, say, side menu expanded is false, we set it to one path, and when it's true we set it to another. Or we could just set this path specifically, or this image in the background, on the view model. It's really preference whichever way we do it, but for now I'm just going to set this in the background view model to a path. So we'll remove that, set the binding, and call it side menu image path, or side menu image, because it's going to return the actual image. And so now we need a private. I'm going to do SVG image because that's the one it's going to be, so we might as well keep it that way. And we'll do side menu image. This can be an observable property. We will have the Avalonia skier SVG image. Now, because we want to update this image when this value changes, what we will want to do is also add a notify property changed for. And if we look at the helper, so if you just hover over this, you can see it gives us examples here. We want to do the name of the other property that's going to change. And then in the other property, we'll simply make it a public getter. There's no need to do anything with observable property. So we can remove this, make this directly a public property of SVG image. We'll give it the right name now, side menu image. And then in here, if we do svg source.load, this is what's going to be called in the background. Now we can pass in the string to the asset path. That will rely on the sidebar being expanded. So let's just give it two options for now. And then close like this. That's going to return an SVG source, not an SVG image. So now we can do a new SVG image with the source set to the source we've just generated. This should now generate an image. Here we want the paths to each. So we can do, say, an interpolated string, which will be assets, images, and then we can open and close, move this source in, and then after .svg. Now all we need to do is set the expanded image, which will be logo, or the collapsed image, which will be icon. That will give us the string, and it would help if I put this in the right place. So it's actually going to be there where we want that. And when we're doing this expression, we'll also need to bracket that. There we go, got the syntax correct now. So now we have an SVG image that's based off of the side menu expanded value. And finally, if we update this notify property changed for, we want to update this. So it will be the name of this property. What that should do is every time the side menu expanded changes, it should change or fire a notification to tell it to refetch this, which will then call this logic here to pull in the right image. This may be completely wrong at the minute, but let's just build and see if we've got it right. You can see now we have no visibility and no image. Let's just run this to see, because the logic might not work on the preview side. And that gives us an error relative URL without base URL. So that will be, of course, because we're just loading a path directly. And these are Avalonia resources. So the way we access a resource is with avares for Avalonia resource, ://. Now we need to tell it which project it's in, which will be this batch process 3 project. So we can just type in batch process 3. Let's just make sure this works first. And there we can see the icon. Now instead of doing this, let's just break that out, do name of, and specify the actual namespace. Then if we ever rename this namespace, our resource is going to update and always match. Let's see if that now works. So that works for there. Change this to true, and we should now get the other image. There we go. So now we have the property changing. Instead of just rerunning this, let's just quickly hook up this image to be on double click. Let's update the property. Now there's several ways we could do this. We could change it to a button and handle things like clicked or double clicked. Or, considering we just want to keep this an image, there will be a pointer pressed event. If we just tab onto this, tab to create a method in the back end, and put some basic logic here. So if e.clickCount isn't equal to 2, then return, we'll now get here when there is a double click event. In this double click event is when we want to fire the command. Now doing code behind is perfectly valid when it's related to the UI. So we've got a UI here and code behind for the UI here. We don't want to do any data logic here, but this is entirely related to views and view binding. So what we want to do is create, if we get rid of these windows, we want a command in here that can be fired to update this side menu expanded. So we don't want to explicitly set side menu expanded to true or false. We could do, but instead we probably want a command that will hide or show the menu. So for that, we'll have a private void side menu resize, I think we'll call it. We'll tag this with a relay command, which is then going to be a command we can bind to, which is effectively a function or a method. And in here, what we'll do is just toggle the side menu. So we'll do side menu expanded, and you can do either isn't equal to true to toggle, or you could do side menu expanded equals not side menu expanded. This one's a bit easier to read logically, so we'll do that. That will toggle the menu on and off. We now have the command we want to bind to. And in the back end, all we need to do is call that command. We'll have to cast the main view model here, which will be the data context. That's how we then access the view model that's bound to this view. And now in there, you can see we have side menu resize command and .execute. So this will now call the menu. You can also just double check with a null check that if there is no command, it won't crash. And it's also recommending that the data context could be null, so we'll do a null check here as well. Or is it going to recommend we don't do this because of that? There we go. So that's now the correct way to call it with null safety in mind. If we put a breakpoint here, run the code, and if all's gone well and we've done this correct, if we double click here, there we go, we hit, oh actually we're probably going to hit the 1 now and then not the 2. Yep, so we're going to have to untag that because we can't double click with a breakpoint. There's the double click. It's going to call into the data context, which is the view model. It's going to call this command. If we put a breakpoint on this command, you can see it is true and it's going to change it to false. On doing that, you can see now, if we remove the breakpoints, we can double click to change that property. The next thing, well I think actually the only thing left is to resize this image. It's now left as a view specific property. So I don't think the width of this icon should be in the view model because it's very specific to the view. So this one is more of a tricky one of where we should put it because it's kind of very relative to this exact view. So really the value should stay in this view. So this is where I think we should use a value converter because purely we only care about if we're changing this view here visually, the number doesn't relate to anything except this exact view, if that makes sense. So instead of storing, say, the number 22 in this view model that doesn't know about this view, the way we want to size this view will really depend on the actual view. The other thing we could do here, to be honest, which probably makes this a bit cleaner as well, because I don't really like this image doing all this. Now, it is easy to do and you've seen how to do it, but let's just delete that instead. And we won't update that either. And what we're going to do is copy and paste this twice, put 2 of them in, and this will now be back to what it was. So we can have assets, images, logo at 220. This makes more sense. Have a second image, assets, images, icon.svg with a width of 22. And all we need to do now is bind the visibility to binding of side menu expanded. We want the full visible image. So this would be a way to bind like this, but you can't do just a not, as you will see. You can't bind to the inverted property. And let's just forget, this should actually be SVG image, not just a path. Don't need the first forward slash. There's that. And unless they've added value converters where this does actually allow you to do an inverted check on a boolean, I wouldn't expect that to work without making a value converter, but it might be baked in now. Yeah, and it is actually baked in. So there you can see a kind of double click to expand and contract, which we can now animate. I'm not sure on this height. I kind of think the height going up and down is maybe a bit jarring. We might want to either keep the height the same or just accept that. But let's just animate it first to see if we're okay with it kind of slowly collapsing and expanding. Now, if we go to styles, I've got a feeling this isn't actually going to work though. We just chuck a style on all borders for now. And we'll do the transition stuff, which is property transitions, another transition, double transition on the width. And for a second, yeah, as expected, this won't work because we haven't set the width of the sidebar. So I think if we set the width of the sidebar, which, how can we do that quickly? Let's just do a public int, I don't know, some width. Make it set to when it's expanded 220, when it's collapsed 50, something like that. Do the notify changed for of some width. And now let's just bind, say, this border's width to some width. And now if we run this, I presume, even though the widths are going to be random, we'll probably get animation. So there you can see you now have animation. So I think what we might do, certainly don't want to do this as a solution, binding the width to that, but let's bind, because we are now also changing one image from another, we'd probably want to stack this one on top of the other. So the images are in the same location, like a grid, with them both stacked on top of each other. Then we could fade one out and shrink one in width. And with the text of here, instead of being visible, we'd probably set this width to 0. So really that's more of a animation kind of thing, and we're mainly focusing on view models at the minute. So I think what I'm going to do is just leave that animation out just for the time being, because it's a bit more complicated than what I originally thought it would be, which would just be to hide and show the elements. But for now we have the feature in there. We can now double click to collapse this menu, and you have the items, and you can double click to expand. So that's the kind of view model basics at the minute. We'll obviously be using this throughout, but you can see when you want a function to be bound to, it's called a command, and when you want a field or property, it's called a property. Inside the UI then, you can bind with this binding statement, and we can bind all the elements of the UI this way. I'm going to set that back to true for default. And now we have the view models in here. We can start to focus on, I think, the pages next and try to get some pages created and then have the buttons change between the pages. So that's it for this one, guys. We've now got the basics of the view models in the application, which allows us to move forward much quicker, and we'll move on to doing pages next.